Picture this: a dimly lit medieval library, its towering shelves packed with manuscripts that whisper secrets across centuries. But look closer. Some of these texts aren't what they seem. Their labels are deliberate lies, carefully crafted by the librarians who risked everything to protect ideas too dangerous for their time. These weren't just bookkeepers, they were covert guardians of knowledge, rewriting catalogues to hide heretical truths from those who sought to burn them. Today, we're pulling back the curtain on one of history's most fascinating acts of intellectual rebellion: the librarians who lied to save the ideas that shaped our world. Why would someone entrusted with preserving knowledge deliberately falsify it? The answer lies in an era when a single controversial idea could mean exile, imprisonment, or worse. Medieval Europe was a powder keg of religious and political tension, where unorthodox thoughts were seen as threats to the very fabric of society. Yet, amid this climate of fear, a quiet resistance emerged. Librarians, often monks or scholars, began disguising forbidden texts, slipping radical philosophies into seemingly innocent volumes or mislabeling them entirely. They understood something profound: to save the truth, sometimes you have to bury it in plain sight. What kind of knowledge was worth such deception? Imagine treatises on astronomy that challenged the Earth's place in the cosmos, medical texts questioning ancient dogma, or philosophical works that dared to ponder the nature of divinity outside church doctrine. These were the ideas that could topple empires, and the librarians who safeguarded them knew their role was more than clerical, it was revolutionary. Their cunning didn't just preserve books, it kept the flame of free thought alive during some of history's most oppressive centuries. And here's the twist: their legacy isn't just a footnote. The very same tactics they used, coding, misdirection, selective secrecy, echo in modern struggles over information and censorship. So, as we step into their world, ask yourself, how many truths have survived because someone, somewhere, was brave enough to lie? To understand the librarians' silent rebellion, we first need to grasp the immense power they wielded, not with swords, but with ink and parchment. In monasteries and royal courts across medieval Europe, these keepers of knowledge held a paradoxical position. Officially, their duty was to maintain order in the collections, copying sacred texts and enforcing the intellectual boundaries set by the Church. Unofficially, many became masters of subtle subversion. Picture a Benedictine monk carefully transcribing Aristotle's works on natural philosophy, knowing full well these ideas contradicted church teachings. Or imagine a university librarian in Paris deliberately misfiling a controversial medical treatise between volumes of approved theology. These weren't accidents, they were calculated acts of defiance disguised as clerical errors. The catalogue itself became their secret weapon. In an age when finding a book meant relying on handwritten inventories, a single altered entry could render an entire text invisible to prying eyes. Some librarians developed elaborate coding systems, using saints' feast days or biblical references as markers for forbidden content. A manuscript labeled "Commentary on the Song of Songs" might actually contain radical astronomical theories, while a seemingly dry agricultural manual could hide heretical philosophical arguments in its margins. The most daring even created false covers, rebinding dangerous works with pious titles to throw off inspectors. But why take such risks? Because these librarians understood that ideas, once extinguished, might never be recovered. When the Church banned the works of philosopher Peter Abelard or burned the writings of mystic Marguerite Porete, it wasn't just about punishing individuals, it was about erasing entire ways of thinking. The librarians fighting this cultural amnesia became time travelers of sorts, smuggling fragments of the future into the present. A 13th century scholar hiding Arabic medical texts knew those pages contained knowledge that could save lives centuries later. A curator preserving pagan cosmology texts understood they held alternative visions of the universe future generations might need. Their methods varied as much as their motivations. Some played the long game, burying controversial works deep in collections where only trusted initiates would find them. Others practiced selective sharing, whispering about certain texts only to those deemed ready. A few even employed psychological trickery, placing a forbidden book in plain sight, but giving it such a dull label that authorities would overlook it. What united them was the belief that truth, no matter how inconvenient, deserved preservation, and their legacy endures every time a researcher stumbles upon a misplaced medieval manuscript that changes our understanding of history. Perhaps most remarkably, these librarians operated without any coordinated plan. From Spain to Poland, from Ireland to Sicily, individuals made independent decisions to protect what they valued. There were no secret societies or grand conspiracies, just countless small acts of courage that collectively kept the flame of inquiry burning. When we look at modern debates about censorship and access to information, their story reminds us that the fight for knowledge has always been waged not just in grand speeches, but in quiet corners by those who refuse to let ideas disappear. The catalogue wasn't just a list, it was a labyrinth of deliberate misdirection. Imagine a medieval inquisitor storming into a monastery library, demanding to inspect its holdings for forbidden knowledge. What he'd find was a carefully constructed illusion, an inventory where nothing was quite as it seemed. A text labeled "On the Virtues of Herbs" might actually contain the secrets of alchemical transformation, its true purpose hidden behind a veil of botanical trivia. A treatise boldly titled "Commentary on the Psalms" could conceal radical philosophical arguments between its lines, its heretical heart beating quietly beneath an orthodox surface. These weren't mistakes, they were survival strategies crafted by librarians who understood that the right lie could mean the difference between preservation and ashes. The techniques they used were as ingenious as they were subtle. Some librarians employed what we'd now call keyword camouflage, replacing dangerous terms with harmless equivalents. A discussion of the philosopher's stone might become the gardener's pebble, while controversial astronomical theories could be rebranded as speculations on lantern distances. Others played with authorship, removing names altogether or attributing texts to unimpeachable figures. A work by the banned scholar Averroes might suddenly bear the name of an approved church father, its dangerous ideas now sheltered under a saintly alias. Even the physical organization of books became a tool of deception. A volume on pagan cosmology could be shelved between two volumes of biblical exegesis, its presence explained away as a filing error if questioned. What makes these tactics so remarkable is how they exploited the very system meant to control knowledge. Medieval catalogues followed strict hierarchies: theology at the top, followed by philosophy, science, and so on, a structure designed to reinforce intellectual boundaries. But clever librarians turned this order against itself. By misclassifying a text, they could make it disappear into an unrelated category. A radical medical text arguing for empirical observation over ancient dogma might be catalogued as monastic regulations, ensuring it would never draw the attention of those scanning the medicine section for heresy. Some went further, creating entire phantom categories, liturgical supplements, or agricultural parables that served as hiding places for unconventional ideas. The risks were enormous. In 1580, the Spanish Inquisition mandated that all private libraries submit catalogues for inspection, with severe penalties for omissions. Yet even under this scrutiny, forbidden texts survived. In one documented case, a librarian in Toledo listed a controversial astronomical work as on the measurement of church steeples, knowing inspectors would skim past what sounded like an architectural manual. Another, in Bologna, split a dangerous manuscript into 3 parts, cataloging each under different innocent titles, ensuring only someone with insider knowledge could reassemble the complete work. These manipulations did more than save books, they shaped the future of knowledge itself. When Copernicus began formulating his heliocentric model in the 16th century, he drew on astronomical texts that had survived the Middle Ages precisely because librarians had disguised them as astrology manuals. The recovery of ancient Greek philosophy during the Renaissance relied heavily on manuscripts that had been mislabeled for centuries. Even today, scholars occasionally stumble upon lost works in library inventories, their true identities hidden behind centuries-old deceptions. The deeper lesson here is about the fragility of truth and the extraordinary lengths some will go to protect it. These medieval librarians remind us that censorship rarely succeeds completely because ideas have a way of outsmarting those who try to erase them. They also challenge our modern assumptions about neutrality in information management. In an age where algorithms determine what knowledge we see, their story asks us, who gets to decide what's worth remembering and what happens when we let others make that choice for us? Every time we uncover one of their clever deceptions, it's not just a historical curiosity, it's proof that knowledge, when guarded by the right hands, can endure even the darkest periods. The Church's campaign against heretical knowledge wasn't just about silencing dissent, it was a systematic effort to control the very boundaries of thought. Scientific works suggesting the Earth revolved around the Sun, pagan philosophies celebrating alternative cosmologies, even Christian mystics' writings that deviated from official doctrine, all were marked for destruction. Authorities didn't merely burn books, they sought to erase entire worldviews, ensuring no trace of dangerous ideas could challenge the established order. But what made these texts so threatening? Take the case of 12th century nun Hildegard of Bingen, whose visionary writings on medicine and cosmology were nearly condemned for blending science with spiritual revelation. Or the fate of Arabic astronomical texts, which introduced mathematical precision to celestial study, but were labeled diabolical for contradicting biblical literalism. The punishment for preserving such works wasn't just a slap on the wrist. A librarian caught sheltering forbidden knowledge risked excommunication, a spiritual death sentence in medieval society, or worse, execution. In 1284, the Parisian book collector Etienne de Montigny was publicly flogged for possessing a single copy of Aristotle's Physics, deemed too materialistic for Christian audiences. Yet despite these horrors, the resistance persisted. Some librarians became experts in the art of plausible deniability. When church inspectors demanded inventories, they'd omit controversial titles entirely or list them under decoy names. A copy of Lucretius's On the Nature of Things, with its atomic theories and denial of divine intervention, might vanish from the records, only to reappear decades later, rebound as a harmless devotional manual. The stakes were highest for works that directly undermined church authority. Consider the fate of the Gospel of Thomas, an early Christian text excluded from the Bible for its mystical teachings. While official church doctrine emphasized hierarchy and ritual, this gospel preached inner enlightenment accessible to all, a message so subversive that any librarian caught preserving it could face accusations of heresy. Yet fragments survived, hidden inside less provocative volumes like liturgical commentaries or saints' lives. Similarly, medical texts advocating dissection or empirical observation were often disguised as herbals or moral treatises, their groundbreaking ideas concealed beneath layers of misdirection. What's striking is how these acts of preservation weren't just about defiance, they were acts of foresight. The librarians safeguarding Galen's anatomical studies or Avicenna's medical encyclopedias knew these works contained truths future generations might need. When the Black Death ravaged Europe in the 14th century, it was often these forbidden texts preserved in secret that offered the most effective treatments while approved church-sanctioned remedies failed. The same pattern repeated in astronomy, where clandestinely kept Arabic star charts enabled navigational advances the church initially rejected. This underground network of knowledge guardians operated without central coordination, yet their collective impact was profound. A Benedictine monk in Germany might hide a pagan philosopher's work in a wine barrel, while a university librarian in Italy sewed radical pages into the bindings of approved textbooks. Their methods varied, but their goal was unified: to ensure no idea, no matter how inconvenient, was lost to history, and their success reshaped the world. When Renaissance scholars rediscovered these lost texts centuries later, they weren't just reading old books, they were unlocking doors the medieval church had tried to seal forever. The irony, many of these once dangerous ideas became cornerstones of modern science and philosophy, proving the librarians right: truth, no matter how suppressed, always finds a way back. Among the most dramatic examples of these hidden texts is the Hermetica, a series of writings attributed to the mythical sage Hermes Trismegistus. Blending philosophy, astrology, and mysticism, these works presented a vision of the universe so radical that their mere possession could land a scholar in chains. Yet they survived not by chance, but because librarians disguised them as something else entirely. In the library of a 15th-century Florentine monastery, one copy was tucked inside a manuscript on bloodletting techniques, its true nature hidden behind detailed illustrations of medicinal leeches. Another surfaced in Spain, rebound as a treatise on vineyard management, its pages filled with coded diagrams that only initiates could decipher. For centuries, these texts were dismissed as lost, until Renaissance scholars peeling back layers of deception realized they'd been staring at them all along, camouflaged as mundane reference works. Equally astonishing is the story of the Gnostic Gospel's early Christian texts deemed too dangerous for inclusion in the Bible. While the Church ordered these writings destroyed, librarians in Egyptian monasteries devised an ingenious solution. They buried them not in the ground, but in plain sight. One particularly bold keeper in Nag Hammadi shelved a forbidden gospel between two volumes of agricultural records, labeling it simply, "On the Care of Olive Trees." The ruse worked so well that when a farmer accidentally unearthed the texts in 1945, scholars initially mistook them for farming manuals. Only later did they realize these were the same Gospels the Church had tried to erase, preserved intact because someone centuries earlier had the audacity to lie on a catalogue slip. The survival of these works didn't just save individual texts, it altered the course of intellectual history. Take Marsilio Ficino, the Renaissance philosopher commissioned to translate the Hermetica for the Medici family. The ideas he found there about humanity's divine potential and the interconnectedness of all things became foundational to Renaissance humanism. Similarly, the rediscovered Gnostic Gospels forced scholars to confront uncomfortable questions. What other voices had been silenced, whose visions of spirituality had been erased? None of this would have been possible without those medieval librarians who understood that sometimes the greatest act of preservation is making something disappear. What's remarkable is how these concealments weren't just about hiding, they were about timing. Librarians seemed to grasp that certain ideas needed to wait for the right moment. A 14th century curator in Prague deliberately misfiled a controversial astronomical text, knowing its theories about planetary motion were centuries ahead of their time. By the time Copernicus encountered similar ideas 200 years later, the world was finally ready to listen. This wasn't just preservation, it was intellectual time travel, with librarians as the guides ensuring no idea, no matter how premature, was lost to the flames. The legacy of these hidden texts challenges our assumptions about historical progress. We often imagine knowledge advancing in a straight line, but the truth is messier, full of detours, dead ends, and ideas forced into hiding until the world caught up. Every time a scholar today pores over a manuscript with suspiciously altered margins or a suspiciously bland title, they're walking in the footsteps of those medieval librarians who understood that truth isn't just about what's written, it's about what survives to be read. The art of medieval librarianship wasn't just about organization. It was a high-stakes game of intellectual sleight of hand. Picture a librarian carefully dismantling a forbidden manuscript, its pages quietly dispersed across a dozen unrelated volumes. One section might nestle between psalms in a hymnal, another tucked into a treatise on horse breeding, each fragment innocuous on its own but revolutionary when reassembled by the right hands. This wasn't mere disorganization, it was a deliberate strategy to ensure that even if authorities seized part of a text, the whole truth remained elusive. Some librarians took deception further, mastering the subtle power of abbreviations and marginalia, a seemingly random series of letters in a catalogue, D. NPC Fall 22 might signal to initiates where to find Democritus's forbidden theories on atomic matter, while appearing as mundane shelf markings to inspectors. Others exploited the biases of their opponents, knowing censors would skim past certain subjects. A radical medical text advocating dissection could be safely catalogued under sermon aids because church officials, trained to hunt for theological heresy, rarely scrutinized practical manuals. Even the physical presentation of books became a tool, worn covers suggesting age and obscurity, or overly ornate bindings designed to intimidate curious novices from probing further. The most daring tactic, the creation of entirely false identities for dangerous works. A librarian in 14th century Bologna, famously rebound Averroes's controversial commentaries on Aristotle with a cover proclaiming it, Lives of the Desert Fathers, complete with fabricated marginal notes praising monastic virtues. The ruse was so convincing that when church inspectors examined it, they commended the library for its pious collections, never realizing they'd held the very ideas they sought to eradicate. Another, in Oxford, disguised a compendium of Arabic astronomy as a cookbook, its star charts cleverly labeled as recipes for feast day dishes. What's striking is how these methods reveal librarians' intimate understanding of human psychology. They knew censors would prioritize searching for certain keywords or authors, so they avoided them entirely. They recognized that authorities expected heresy to look dramatic, flamboyant illustrations, inflammatory titles, so they hid it in plain sight beneath layers of apparent dullness. A controversial text on free will might be given a spine label so excruciatingly specific on the proper storage of Lenten garments in humid climates that no inspector would bother pulling it from the shelf. The risks of these deceptions were immense. In 1290, a Parisian librarian was imprisoned for a decade after being caught altering catalogue entries. His defense claiming clerical error, an excuse that only worked once, yet the practice persisted because the alternative, allowing knowledge to vanish forever, was unthinkable. These librarians weren't just preserving books, they were playing chess with history, sacrificing pawns to protect queens. When we uncover their tricks today, a misaligned page here, An oddly specific shelf mark there. We're not just finding old books. We're decoding a secret language of survival, one that whispers across centuries about the extraordinary lengths humans will go to safeguard ideas. Monastic Scriptoria, those quiet rooms where monks spent hours bent over parchment, were far more than copying workshops. They became secret fortresses for ideas too dangerous for the outside world. Imagine a scene, candlelight flickering across desks as scribes meticulously reproduced sacred texts, their quills scratching in unison. But look closer. Between the lines of approved scripture, hidden in the margins of illuminated psalters, or slipped into the binding of a missal, traces of forbidden knowledge quietly took root. These scriptoria operated under a delicate balance, officially serving the Church's mission, while covertly safeguarding the very ideas it sought to erase. The process was brilliantly subtle. A scribe copying Aristotle's works on natural philosophy might insert a seemingly innocent commentary about the wonders of God's creation, subtly reframing controversial ideas about the physical world within orthodox language. Another, transcribing an Arabic medical text, could omit the author's name but preserve the groundbreaking content, letting the knowledge survive while its origins faded. Some went further, embedding radical thoughts in the decorative initials or border illustrations, a tiny figure holding an astrolabe hidden in the curve of a letter, or cosmological diagrams disguised as floral patterns. These weren't accidents, they were acts of quiet rebellion disguised as devotion. Trust was the glue holding this system together. Scriptoria functioned like intellectual families, with senior monks overseeing teams of scribes. When a trusted member introduced a suppressed text into the copying queue, others would recognize the unspoken signal, perhaps a particular ink formulation or parchment quality, and work carefully around it. In some monasteries, scribes developed coded systems, a specific stitch in the binding thread indicating a modified text, or a barely noticeable dot pattern in the margin flagging pages with altered content. The collaborative nature of the work provided perfect cover. If questioned, any scribe could honestly claim they'd only copied what was given to them, their individual contributions blurred into the collective effort. The risks were staggering. In 1184, the abbot of Cluny discovered a scriptorium secretly reproducing the works of philosopher Peter Abelard, whose ideas had been explicitly condemned. The consequences were swift and brutal. The lead scribe was imprisoned, the manuscripts burned, yet within decades, fragments of those same texts resurfaced in distant monasteries, carefully woven into commentaries on less controversial material. This pattern repeated across Europe. Suppression would strike in one place, only for the knowledge to emerge elsewhere, like water finding new cracks in stone. What's often overlooked is how these scribes shaped the knowledge they preserved. A text copied in a scriptorium wasn't just duplicated, it was subtly transformed. A controversial passage might be paired with an orthodox interpretation, or a radical idea softened with qualifying phrases. Over generations, these small alterations created layered texts, where surface readings satisfied authorities while deeper meanings waited for discerning eyes. Some scribes even left clues for future readers, tiny annotations in Greek or Hebrew tucked into Latin texts, or cryptic references to page numbers in unrelated volumes. They weren't just preserving knowledge, they were creating treasure maps for posterity. The Scriptoria's legacy extends far beyond medieval Europe. When Renaissance scholars like Pico della Mirandola began uncovering lost classical texts, many weren't truly lost. They'd been hiding in plain sight, patiently waiting in monastic libraries for the right moment. The same techniques medieval scribes used to protect forbidden knowledge later inspired early modern scientists facing their own censors. Galileo, under house arrest for his astronomical theories, employed similar methods, encoding controversial ideas in seemingly innocent letters, just as those monastic scribes had done centuries before. The Scriptoria didn't just save books, they created a playbook for intellectual resistance that still resonates today. Perhaps most remarkably, these scribes understood something profound about the nature of ideas, that they can't truly be destroyed, only delayed. By embedding radical thoughts in approved texts, they ensured that even if one copy was burned, another might survive disguised as something else. Their greatest deception wasn't in the ink or parchment. It was in making authorities believe they'd won, while the ideas themselves slipped quietly into the future. Every time we rediscover one of their hidden gems, we're not just uncovering history, we're witnessing the victory of patience over power. Marginalia, those scribbles in the margins of medieval manuscripts, were far more than idle doodles or stray notes. They became secret battlegrounds where librarians and scholars waged quiet wars against intellectual suppression. Imagine a monk carefully copying an approved theological text, his quill dutifully tracing each Latin phrase. But in the blank spaces along the edges, he adds something unexpected, a tiny diagram of planetary orbits contradicting church doctrine, or a cryptic reference to a banned philosopher's work. To the untrained eye, it's just marginal clutter. To those in the know, it's a smuggled manifesto. The genius of marginalia lay in its plausible deniability. Unlike full texts which could be seized and burned, these annotations floated in a gray area too fragmentary to constitute heresy on their own, yet rich with hidden meaning when connected. A librarian might subtly guide scholars to clarify certain passages with marginal notes that actually undermine the main text, a seemingly pious comment like, "as St. Augustine teaches," could mask a radical interpretation if read between the lines. Some marginalia even employed visual codes, sketches of plants or animals that, when examined closely, contained geometric diagrams or alchemical symbols. The margins became a parallel text, whispering alternative truths alongside the official narrative. One particularly bold example survives in a 14th century Bible held at a French monastery. The main text is impeccably orthodox, but the margins tell a different story. Next to a passage condemning earthly knowledge, an anonymous scribe drew a tiny ladder ascending to the stars, a silent rebuke of anti-intellectualism. Elsewhere, a list of pious questions about Scripture subtly echoes the very heresies the Church sought to erase. These weren't random acts of rebellion. They were calculated interventions, using the physical space of the page to create dialogue where none was permitted. The collaborative nature of marginalia made it especially powerful. Over decades, multiple hands might contribute to a manuscript's margins, building layered conversations across generations. A scholar in one century would pose a dangerous question in Greek shorthand. Another, 100 years later, would answer it in Hebrew, coded as penmanship exercises. Librarians facilitated these exchanges by strategically placing controversial books in the hands of sympathetic readers, knowing each would leave behind traces of dissent like intellectual breadcrumbs. Some monasteries even developed systems where certain shelf locations or bookmarks signaled which volumes were open for marginal commentary, creating an underground network of ideas hidden in plain sight. What's remarkable is how marginalia exploited medieval reading practices. Unlike modern readers who often skim silently, medieval scholars typically read aloud and pondered texts deeply. A single provocative marginal note could send a reader down unexpected paths of thought, their own reflections becoming part of the manuscript's hidden legacy. Sometimes the most subversive content wasn't in the notes themselves, but in what they prompted readers to imagine. A simple "why" scribbled next to a doctrinal claim, could be more destabilizing than a full heretical treatise because it invited the reader to become co-conspirator in questioning authority. The Church wasn't oblivious to these tricks. By the 13th century, some inspectors began scrutinizing margins as closely as main texts, leading librarians to develop ever more creative concealment methods. Notes might be written in ink that faded over time, leaving only ghostly traces. Others used abbreviations so dense they resembled copying marks unless decoded with a cipher. A particularly clever tactic involved writing controversial notes upside down or mirrored, requiring a polished metal surface to read them, a medieval version of encryption. These marginal conversations didn't just preserve forbidden ideas, they transformed how knowledge circulated. When Renaissance scholars rediscovered annotated manuscripts centuries later, they often found the margins more enlightening than the primary text. The handwritten debates between generations of readers became historical records of intellectual resistance, proving that even in the darkest periods, curiosity couldn't be fully extinguished, only driven underground, where it continued to burn in the spaces between the lines. Today, when we study these manuscripts, we're not just reading books, we're eavesdropping on clandestine conversations that refuse to be silenced. Beneath the surface of medieval Europe's intellectual life pulsed a hidden circulatory system, secret networks of scholars moving forbidden knowledge like blood through veins. These weren't just casual exchanges between colleagues, but meticulously organized operations spanning kingdoms and languages. Picture a Benedictine monk in Burgundy receiving what appears to be a routine letter about liturgical reforms. To anyone else, the phrasing seems perfectly orthodox, but certain turns of phrase, "the harvest requires new tools," or "our brother in Christ sends warm regards," signal that a copy of Aristotle's banned Physics has arrived disguised as a prayer book. Such coded language transformed ordinary correspondence into an elaborate dance of deception, where every pleasantry could carry double meanings known only to initiates. The logistics of these networks reveal astonishing sophistication. Certain monasteries became waystations along underground knowledge routes, their libraries serving as temporary shelters for illicit texts. A book might spend a few months in a French abbey catalogued as Sermon Notes Volume 3, then move to an Italian university disguised as a legal commentary, its journey coordinated through seemingly innocent travelers' letters. Librarians played pivotal roles as both curators and couriers, developing systems where the placement of a book on a shelf, slightly protruding or bound in a particular color, signaled its availability for discreet transfer. Some even created fake borrowing records, listing controversial works as checked out by long-dead scholars to explain their absence during inspections. Geography became an ally in this clandestine trade. The sheer physical distance between centers of learning provided natural protection. A text condemned in Paris might still circulate freely in Barcelona, allowing scholars to exploit jurisdictional gaps in censorship. Networks stretched from Oxford to Krakow, with trusted intermediaries ensuring safe passage across borders. Jewish scholars played particularly crucial roles in these exchanges, their multilingualism and experience navigating between Christian and Islamic intellectual traditions, making them ideal bridges for preserving endangered knowledge. The famed Toledo School of Translators, while officially sanctioned, secretly funneled Arabic scientific texts into Christian Europe through carefully managed channels. What's striking is how these networks adapted to threats. When church authorities in 1327 began intercepting letters between English and Italian scholars, the networks responded by developing more elaborate ciphers. Some began using alchemical symbols as code, while others embedded messages in musical notation or architectural sketches. A particularly clever system used the saints' days listed in calendar manuscripts to encode meeting dates, a notation so mundane it escaped notice. The risks were ever present. In 1348, a scholar at the University of Paris was exposed when authorities deciphered his seemingly innocent note about needing fresh parchment as a request for Averroes' commentaries. Yet even arrests rarely collapsed entire networks. They simply prompted more creative concealment methods. These underground exchanges did more than preserve texts. They sustained entire schools of thought that official channels tried to erase. The survival of Neoplatonic philosophy, the transmission of Arabic mathematics, even early challenges to geocentrism, all owed their continuity to these hidden conversations. When Renaissance humanists later rediscovered classical knowledge, they were often simply accessing strands of thought that had never truly been lost, just carefully guarded by generations of scholars who understood that ideas once extinguished might never be reborn. The true legacy of these networks isn't just in the texts they saved, but in proving that no amount of institutional control can completely silence the human hunger for knowledge. Perhaps most remarkably, these networks operated without central leadership or formal membership. They grew organically through shared purpose and personal trust, proving that intellectual freedom has always found ways to flourish in the cracks of even the most oppressive systems. When we look at modern efforts to restrict information, their story offers a powerful reminder. Where there are people determined to seek truth, there will always be others willing to help them find it, quietly, ingeniously, and against all odds. The shadow of the Inquisition stretched long across medieval libraries, turning every footstep in the corridor into a potential death knell for hidden knowledge. Librarians working under such conditions didn't just risk their collections, they gambled with their lives. Consider the case of Brother Henry of Clairvaux, who in 1322 was caught with a mislabeled copy of the condemned work, The Mirror of Simple Souls. His punishment, public immolation along with the offending manuscript, a grim spectacle designed to terrify others into compliance. Yet within a year, 3 copies of the same text surfaced in distant monasteries, each disguised with different deceptive labels, proof that fear, however paralyzing, couldn't extinguish the determination to preserve truth. The inspection process itself was a psychological battlefield. Inquisitors arrived with meticulously prepared lists of banned titles and authors, cross-referencing every volume against the index of forbidden works. But librarians developed counter-strategies worthy of military tacticians. Some kept dual catalogues, one pristine for official review, another hidden beneath floorboards with the true inventory. Others exploited the inspector's own assumptions, knowing they'd focus on lavish volumes while overlooking modest pamphlets. A particularly cunning tactic involved placing obviously controversial but less dangerous works in prominent locations as decoys, drawing attention away from more subversive texts hidden in plain sight as reference materials. The game was perilous. A single nervous glance toward a concealed compartment or an overly quick denial could arouse suspicion. The consequences of discovery varied by region and era. In Mediterranean cities under papal scrutiny, punishment was swift and brutal executions, public book burnings, and the dissolution of entire libraries. Northern European monasteries often faced subtler sanctions, removal of scriptorium privileges, exile of key scholars, or the installment of loyalist abbots to oversee reformed collections. Yet paradoxically, these very crackdowns sometimes aided preservation efforts. When the Archbishop of Canterbury ordered a purge of suspect texts in 1389, librarians across England responded by dispersing their forbidden holdings, splitting single manuscripts into fragments smuggled out by different routes, ensuring that even if part was seized, the whole might survive elsewhere. What's often overlooked is how these threats shaped the physical books themselves. Fear of discovery led to innovations in concealment that bordered on artistry. Some librarians commissioned Trojan bindings, innocuous religious covers housing radical contents, complete with fake title pages and filler parchment to mimic expected page counts. Others developed techniques for creating hidden compartments within thick wooden covers, detectable only by pressing specific carvings in sequence. The most desperate resorted to palimpsests, scraping off controversial texts to overwrite them with approved ones, though sometimes leaving traces legible under certain angles of light, like whispers beneath shouts. The psychological toll was immense. Correspondence between librarians reveals constant dread of trusted scribes turning informant, of accidental slips in conversation, even of confessional betrayals. A letter from a 14th century Catalan librarian pleads with a colleague to burn his messages after reading, citing nightmares about the inquisitor's hands upon my inkpot. Yet amid this terror, dark humor flourished as resistance. One marginal doodle in a German monastery's ledger shows a mouse labeled censor gnawing on the wrong book, a quiet jab at authorities too obtuse to recognize real heresy. This atmosphere of perpetual danger bred extraordinary acts of courage. When the Library of Monte Cassino faced inspection in 1412, the head librarian deliberately triggered a small fire in a storage room, using the chaos to spirit condemned manuscripts out through a sewer passage. In Oxford, scholars developed an elaborate system of hand signals to warn colleagues when inspectors entered the building, allowing them to swap labels on the fly. Each act of defiance, no matter how small, wove another thread in the safety net that caught falling knowledge before it could be lost forever. The legacy of this fear resonates beyond medieval history. Every time a modern researcher uncovers one of these disguised texts, a philosophical treat is masquerading as a cookbook, an astronomical chart hidden in a hymnal. We're reminded that censorship's greatest failure lies in underestimating the creativity of those determined to outwit it. The librarians who worked under such threats didn't just save books. They proved that ideas guarded by courage and ingenuity can outlast even the most determined efforts to erase them. Their story challenges us to consider what truths we might be willing to hide and what prices we'd pay to ensure they survive for those who come after. Hugo of St. Victor wasn't your typical medieval librarian. While officially tasked with maintaining the abbey's collection according to church doctrine, whispers persisted that he orchestrated something far more subversive, an elaborate system of lost manuscripts. Historical accounts describe how he would publicly lament the disappearance of certain controversial works, while privately ensuring they remained accessible to trusted scholars through deliberate catalogue errors. A text listed as missing might actually be shelved under a false classification, its true identity known only to initiates. Hugo's genius lay in weaponizing bureaucracy itself. By controlling the official inventory, he could make knowledge vanish from record without actually removing it from the shelves. Then there's Richard de Fournival, the 13th century scholar whose personal library became a legend. As physician to the French king, Richard had unparalleled access to banned medical texts from Arabic and Jewish traditions, works the church viewed as dangerously heterodox. His solution, a catalogue so meticulously deceptive it functioned as a puzzle. Entries for on fevers might conceal Avicenna's groundbreaking theories on contagion, while notes on humors could mask dissections contradicting Gaelic dogma. Richard took pride in this duality, even encoding hints in his poetry. One verse boasts of books that sing two songs, a clear reference to his practice of giving texts orthodox titles while preserving their radical content. What makes these figures so fascinating is how they navigated the contradictions of their roles. on paper, they were faithful servants of institutional authority. In practice, they became architects of an underground intellectual network. Hugo's students reported how he would stage accidental discoveries during library inspections, dramatically unearthing lost orthodox texts to distract from the heretical ones hidden nearby. Richard, meanwhile, exploited his royal connections to shield his collection, once convincing King Louis IX that his annotated copy of Aristotle's Metaphysics was merely entertainment for dull evenings. Their methods varied, but their goal unified: to create spaces where forbidden knowledge could breathe, if only in the shadows. The risks they took were far from theoretical. In 1244, Hugo narrowly avoided expulsion after an informant reported his unusual shelving practices, his defense claiming that errors resulted from his poor eyesight only worked because of his reputation as a pious scholar. Richard faced greater scrutiny. His library was raided twice by Dominican inquisitors, though they never found the most controversial texts, thanks to his habit of loaning them to rural monasteries before inspections. Both men left behind cryptic instructions for successors. Hugo's disciples spoke of a key of St. Jerome, likely a cipher for decoding his catalogue. Richard willed his collection to the Sorbonne with strict conditions about its organization, ensuring his system of concealment would outlive him. Their legacies force us to reconsider what librarianship meant in an age of censorship. These weren't rogue actors, but respected figures who used their institutional positions to shield ideas from destruction. When Hugo taught that learning is the eye of the soul, he wasn't just quoting Augustine, he was justifying his quiet campaign to keep that eye open. Richard's famed Biblionomia, a manual on library science, contained veiled advice on how to nourish diverse appetites within a single collection. In their hands, the catalogue became both shield and sword, a tool to protect knowledge from those who feared it, and to pass that knowledge forward when the world might finally be ready to receive it. The irony: many works they safeguarded became foundational to later scholarship. Hugo's missing Neoplatonic texts resurfaced during the Renaissance, fueling Marsilio Ficino's revival of classical philosophy. Richard's medical manuscripts, preserved under false labels, informed surgeons challenging medieval dogma centuries later. Their stories remind us that preservation isn't always about display. Sometimes it's about knowing when to make truth invisible until the moment it can truly be seen. When Renaissance humanists began combing through Europe's monastic libraries in the 15th century, they weren't just discovering old books. They were unearthing intellectual time capsules, carefully packed by medieval librarians centuries earlier. Take the case of Pico della Mirandola, the fiery young philosopher who in 1486 stunned the church by citing long-lost Hermetic texts in his Oration on the Dignity of Man. Those very manuscripts had survived the Middle Ages disguised as biblical commentaries in a Florentine monastery, their true identities hidden behind layers of deliberate mislabeling. Pico's radical vision of human potential, that people could shape their own destiny through knowledge, drew directly from ideas that should have been erased, had librarians not spun webs of deception to save them. The impact rippled far beyond philosophy. In astronomy, Copernicus's revolutionary heliocentric model didn't spring fully formed from his imagination. It built upon Arabic star charts and Greek planetary theories that had circulated clandestinely for generations, often shelved under titles like On Ecclesiastical Timekeeping or The Spiritual Orbits of Saints. One particularly pivotal text, Aristarchus of Samo's ancient argument that the earth moved around the sun, survived the medieval period only because a Krakow librarian had catalogued it as an allegorical treatise on divine stationariness, fooling censors into overlooking its explosive content. When Copernicus encountered these ideas in the early 16th century, he wasn't just reading old theories. He was tapping into an underground river of preserved knowledge that flowed directly from antiquity to his desk. Medicine underwent a parallel transformation thanks to these rescued texts. Medieval librarians had hidden Arabic anatomical studies behind covers proclaiming moral lessons from the body's humors, allowing Vesalius to access accurate diagrams of human organs centuries later. The works of Ibn Sina, known in Europe as Avicenna, should have been purged during the Church's crackdown on non-Christian science. Instead, they resurfaced in Renaissance Padua disguised as herbal remedy books, their groundbreaking descriptions of circulation and infection now fueling a new empirical approach to healing. Even something as seemingly innocuous as a mislabeled botanical manuscript could change history, like the one that allowed Renaissance physicians to finally distinguish between poisonous and medicinal plants. A breakthrough built on knowledge librarians had protected by classifying it as monastic garden poetry. The metaphysical revolutions of the period owe equal debt to these acts of preservation. Marsilio Ficino's translations of Plato cornerstones of Renaissance thought relied on manuscripts that had survived the Middle Ages hidden inside volumes of church law. Neoplatonic ideas about the soul's divine nature, condemned as heretical in the 12th century, re-emerged in 15th century Florence because librarians had rebranded them as Augustinian meditations. Even the Protestant Reformation drew from long-suppressed critiques of church authority that had been kept alive in library margins and disguised catalogues. When Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the Wittenberg church door in 1517, he was channeling arguments that medieval librarians had safeguarded by labeling them speculative theology for academic debate. What's often overlooked is how these resurfaced ideas didn't just influence Renaissance thinkers, they created entirely new ways of engaging with knowledge. The very act of rediscovery taught scholars to question what other truths might lie buried, fueling a culture of investigation that defined the era. Galileo's telescope, Vesalius' dissections, even Montaigne, his essays all carried echoes of that medieval lesson. That progress depends not just on new discoveries, but on the survival of old ones. The librarians who lied to protect these texts did more than save parchment and ink. They ensured that when Europe finally awoke from its dogmatic slumber, the tools for rebuilding knowledge were waiting, polished bright by centuries of secret guardianship. The ultimate irony, many Enlightenment thinkers who later championed reason over tradition had no idea their fiercest arguments were made possible by the very institutions they criticized. The light of the 18th century was kindled by medieval hands that carefully mislabeled catalogues, sewed forbidden pages into dull bindings, and whispered directions to trusted seekers. When Diderot and D'Alembert compiled their Encyclopédie in the 1700s, they stood on the shoulders of librarians who understood that truth, to endure, sometimes needs a disguise. Their legacy challenges our modern narratives about progress, reminding us that history's most transformative ideas often survive not through bold declarations, but through the quiet, cunning devotion of those who refuse to let them die. Every shelf in a medieval library was a battleground where the politics of knowledge played out in silent, meticulous strokes. Cataloguing wasn't just administrative work, it was a high-stakes game of intellectual gatekeeping. When a librarian labeled a controversial astronomical text as devotional musings on the heavens, they weren't making a clerical error, they were making a political statement about who had the right to access certain truths. These acts of deliberate misclassification reveal a profound truth. The organization of knowledge is never neutral. It's always shaped by the fears, biases, and agendas of those in power or those resisting it. Consider the parallels to our digital age. Medieval catalogers manipulating entries to hide heretical texts functioned much like modern algorithms that suppress or promote certain information based on invisible criteria. A 14th century monk might disguise a banned medical treatise as a cookbook, just as today's content moderators might flag a post about vaccine efficacy as misinformation based on ever-shifting guidelines. The mechanisms have evolved, but the underlying struggle remains the same. Who gets to decide what counts as truth and who gets to access it? The Church's Index of Forbidden Books, a precursor to modern censorship lists, relied on librarians to enforce its prohibitions. Yet many of these same librarians became masters of subverting the system. They developed coded cataloging languages, like using saints' feast days to mark controversial texts or shelving philosophy works under agriculture headings. These weren't just clever tricks, they were acts of defiance against a worldview that sought to monopolize truth. When a Parisian librarian in the 1300s listed a radical Aristotelian work as commentary on Genesis, he wasn't just saving a book, he was challenging the very notion that institutions could dictate what ideas were permissible. What's striking is how these historical tactics mirror contemporary information wars. Just as medieval authorities burned books they deemed dangerous, modern platforms deplatform voices that challenged dominant narratives. The librarians who resisted understood something we're grappling with today. Control over categorization is control over reality. When a medieval catalogue defined a text as theology rather than natural philosophy, it determined whether that work would be celebrated or burned. Similarly, when a modern search algorithm ranks one version of events above another, it shapes what millions accept as fact. The most subversive librarians went further, weaponizing the catalogue's authority to actually promote forbidden ideas. By giving heretical texts bland, respectable classifications, they could sneak them into the hands of curious scholars under the guise of orthodoxy. A daring example comes from 15th century Florence, where a librarian catalogued the radical Hermetic texts as allegorical interpretations of Scripture, ensuring their survival long enough to inspire Renaissance thinkers like Ficino and Pico. This kind of creative cataloging didn't just preserve knowledge, it actively reshaped intellectual history by keeping alternative world-views alive until cultures were ready to receive them. Today, as debates rage over algorithmic bias, shadow banning, and the ethics of content moderation, these medieval precedents offer sobering lessons. They remind us that every system of knowledge organization, whether parchment catalogs or digital databases, carries the fingerprints of human judgment. The librarians who lied understood that in the battle over truth, sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't a bold declaration, but a strategically misleading label. Their legacy challenges us to ask, in our own information age, who plays the role of the medieval censor, and who are the quiet rebels recataloguing truth beneath the surface. Modern scholars armed with cutting-edge tools are finally cracking the codes medieval librarians used to hide forbidden knowledge. Multispectral imaging, a technique that captures light wavelengths beyond human vision, can resurrect faded ink, revealing original texts beneath layers of palimpsest overwriting. Imagine scanning what appears to be a routine 12th century prayer book, only for ultraviolet light to expose an entirely different work lurking beneath, perhaps a treatise on atomism by the condemned philosopher Democritus, carefully erased and rewritten centuries ago to avoid detection. These ghost texts, invisible to the naked eye, now whisper their secrets through technology the original concealers could never have imagined. Linguistic analysis provides another key to unlocking these medieval deceptions. By examining word choices and grammatical structures, researchers can detect when a text's voice doesn't match its purported author. A manuscript attributed to Saint Augustine might contain telltale phrases more characteristic of the rebellious theologian Pelagius, his rival. One breakthrough came when scholars noticed subtle Arabic loanwords in a Latin medical text catalogued as "on Christian healing," proving it was actually a disguised translation of the Muslim physician Al-Razi's work. Even punctuation tells stories. Marginal dots in specific patterns have been identified as coded signals between trusted readers, like intellectual breadcrumbs leading to hidden truths. Comparative cataloging has exposed systematic patterns in medieval misinformation. When researchers cross-referenced inventories from monasteries across Europe, they discovered identical mistakes appearing in distant libraries, a statistical impossibility without coordination. A banned astrological text might consistently be mislabeled as agricultural almanacs in Cologne, Paris, and Bologna, suggesting an underground network sharing concealment strategies. Some librarians even left clues in their cataloging systems, like using specific shelf numbers corresponding to biblical verses that hinted at a book's true content. A manuscript numbered 42 might reference Psalm 42's deep calls to deep, a signal that the text contained profound, hidden knowledge. The detective work extends to physical books themselves. X-ray fluorescence spectrometry can analyze inks and pigments without damaging pages, revealing where texts were altered. In one stunning case, a 14th century herbal manual turned out to be a 9th century pagan cosmology text, its original binding deliberately aged to appear younger. Other discoveries come from reconstructing scattered fragments, like piecing together a philosophical dialogue that had been split across 5 different monasteries, each fragment catalogued as unrelated liturgical notes. Each technological revelation peels back another layer of medieval librarians' ingenuity. They didn't just hide texts, they engineered multi-layered deceptions accounting for how future generations might search. A scribe might copy a dangerous work in faint iron gall ink that would fade naturally over decades, leaving only an approved overwritten text visible, unless someone knew to apply the right chemical reagent. Others used steganography, embedding messages in the decorative initials or marginalia that only made sense when viewed alongside another seemingly unrelated manuscript. The implications go beyond historical curiosity. Every uncovered text forces us to reconsider medieval intellectual life, not as the dark ages of dogma, but as a vibrant underground marketplace of ideas. When scholars recently decoded a botany manual in Vienna's National Library and found it contained detailed heliocentric diagrams predating Copernicus by 3 centuries, it rewrote our understanding of astronomical knowledge's survival. These discoveries remind us that history's winners don't just write the narratives, they sometimes hide them in plain sight, trusting future generations to decipher their ruses. Perhaps most remarkably, the librarian's methods are inspiring modern digital preservationists. As contemporary activists work to safeguard endangered knowledge from political censorship or corporate control, they're adapting medieval tactics using metadata manipulation, decentralized storage, and algorithmic camouflage. The same spirit that once hid radical philosophy behind pious bindings now encrypts digital archives in plain-looking cloud folders. The battle over who controls knowledge never truly ends, it just evolves new disguises. And thanks to these medieval masters of deception, we've inherited not just their hidden texts, but an entire playbook for keeping truth alive against the odds. The medieval librarians who falsified catalogues and disguised forbidden texts faced an ethical dilemma as old as civilization itself. Does the ends justify the means when truth itself is at stake? On one hand, their deception violated the sacred trust placed in them as guardians of knowledge. They manipulated records, obscured origins, and outright lied to authorities. Yet every altered entry, every misleading label, was an act of defiance against systems that sought to erase entire ways of thinking. These weren't petty falsehoods. They were lifelines thrown across centuries to preserve ideas that powers that be deemed too dangerous to exist. Consider the alternative. Had these librarians rigidly adhered to strict honesty, countless works of philosophy, science, and theology would have vanished forever. The Church's index of forbidden books wasn't merely a suggestion, it was an eradication order. When authorities in 1290 burned every copy of David of Dinant's works they could find, they weren't just destroying parchment, they were attempting to extinguish an entire school of thought about the unity of matter and spirit. The few surviving fragments we have today exist solely because someone, somewhere, chose deception over compliance. This raises a haunting question: is it truly dishonest to lie about a book's contents if that lie ensures its truth survives? The librarians' choices mirror modern whistleblowers and underground archivists who safeguard suppressed information. Like them, these medieval guardians operated on a core principle that some truths are so vital, their preservation transcends conventional morality. A 14th-century monk hiding Avera's commentaries behind false bindings wasn't so different from contemporary journalists encrypting sensitive documents to bypass state censorship. Both recognize that when systems weaponize truth, ordinary ethics may require extraordinary exceptions. Yet critics argue this slippery slope risks corroding the very integrity knowledge depends on. If librarians could arbitrarily decide which truths were worth protecting through deception, what stopped them from manipulating less noble agendas? Some likely did, preserving personal biases or fringe theories under the same noble pretext. And without clear boundaries, their well-intentioned lies could have inadvertently fueled misinformation chains still untangled today. What's often overlooked is how these librarians navigated this moral tightrope with remarkable restraint. They didn't hide every controversial idea, just those they believed future generations would need. Medical texts challenging Galen's errors, astronomical charts contradicting geocentrism, philosophical works exploring human dignity. These weren't random choices, but calculated salvations of ideas that would later prove foundational. Their selectivity suggests an implicit ethical framework. Deception wasn't a tool for personal gain, but a last resort for truths too vital to lose. The echoes of their dilemma resound in today's digital age. When tech employees leak documents about algorithmic biases, or when librarians resist demands to ban certain books, they're wrestling with the same core question: when does protecting truth require breaking the rules? The medieval solution, meticulous, targeted deception, offers no easy answers, but it does provide sobering perspective. Sometimes, the moral high ground isn't where the rules say it should be, but where the truth can still breathe. Their legacy challenges us to consider what truths we'd risk our integrity to save, and how far we'd go to ensure they reach those who need them most. For every manuscript that survived thanks to a librarian's cunning deception, countless others vanished forever, burned, scraped away, or left to rot in damp cellars. The holes in our historical record aren't just empty spaces, they're wounds where entire worldviews were excised. Take the tragic case of the Cathar texts, a collection of Gnostic Christian writings systematically destroyed during the Albigensian Crusade in 13th century France. Contemporary accounts describe wagon loads of illuminated manuscripts fed to bonfires in Toulouse's town square, their ashes carried away by the wind. Only fragments survive today, mostly in the form of hostile summaries written by their persecutors, like trying to reconstruct a symphony from the complaints of those who hated its melody. The loss goes beyond specific texts. It's the absence of entire intellectual lineages. When the works of 9th century philosopher John Scotus Iri Eugenia were condemned in 1225, his radical ideas about nature and divinity nearly disappeared entirely. Only 3 copies of his masterpiece, Periphyson, escaped destruction, and scholars still debate how much was altered by nervous scribes during preservation. What insights about early medieval science might his lost commentaries on the mathematical arts have contained? We'll never know, because not a single librarian dared or succeeded in hiding them. Some gaps haunt us precisely because they're so tantalizingly close to being filled. In the Vatican's secret archives, researchers recently discovered a catalogue entry from 1403 describing a dialogue on the 2 world systems, predating Galileo's famous work by 2 centuries. The entry notes it was transferred to an abbey in Umbria, but no such text has ever been found there. Was it destroyed during an inspection, mislabeled into oblivion? Or does it still sit unrecognized on some dusty shelf, waiting for a scholar to peel back its deceptive binding? The most painful losses are those we can quantify. When the University of Paris Library was inventoried in 1338, it listed 42 works by the controversial scholar Siger of Brabant. Today, only 6 survive. The missing 36 treatises on logic, metaphysics, and the nature of the soul represented one of the Middle Ages' most daring attempts to reconcile faith with reason. Their absence leaves a crater in our understanding of medieval philosophy's evolution. We know these texts once sparked furious debates that shaped universities for generations, yet we're left reconstructing their content from second-hand accounts, like trying to map a continent from travelers' rumors. Even successful preservation efforts sometimes came at a cost. Many surviving heretical texts are palimpsest originals scraped away to make room for approved content. Modern technology can sometimes recover the undertext, but not without damage. A 15th century prayer book in Milan's Ambrosian library was found to contain erased passages from the banned Gospel of Judas, but crucial sections remain illegible forever. In these cases, the librarian's very act of preservation, overwriting rather than burning, created new layers of loss. The ripple effects extend beyond academia. When medical texts from the Salerno school were purged for containing Arabic influences, Europe lost centuries of surgical knowledge, a deficit that may have cost countless lives during the Black Death. Astronomical tables destroyed as pagan nonsense could have shaved decades off the scientific revolution. Each vanished text represents not just a missing puzzle piece, but a potential alternate path history might have taken. Yet amid these absences, glimmers of hope persist. Every few years, some long-lost manuscript surfaces in an unexpected place. A battered volume in a Romanian monastery turns out to contain fragments of Origen's condemned commentaries, or a mislabeled ledger in Spain yields pages from Maimonides' suppressed philosophical correspondence. Each discovery reminds us that the medieval librarians' war wasn't entirely lost, just fought on terms we're still learning to decipher. The real lesson lies not in mourning what's gone, but in recognizing how much nearly joined it, and what that tells us about the fragile threads by which knowledge survives. The quiet battles waged in medieval libraries over who controls knowledge didn't end with parchment and ink. They evolved. Today's librarians still navigate the same treacherous currents of censorship and access, armed with digital tools but facing age-old dilemmas. Walk into any modern archive and you'll find echoes of those medieval deceptions. Metadata tags carefully crafted to skirt algorithmic suppression, controversial texts tucked into obscure digital folders under bland titles, even entire shadow libraries masquerading as harmless collections. The players have changed, but the game remains startlingly familiar because the question at its heart is timeless. Who decides what truths are preserved and who gets to see them? Consider the digital archivists preserving endangered knowledge in authoritarian regimes. Like their medieval predecessors rebinding forbidden philosophy as prayer books, they upload suppressed materials to innocent-looking cloud storage labeled family photos, or encode them in blockchain ledgers disguised as cryptocurrency transactions. A librarian in modern-day Istanbul might catalogue an exposé on government corruption under urban planning studies, mirroring the medieval tactic of shelving astronomy texts as agricultural manuals. The parallels go deeper than technique. Both acts share that same quiet defiance, the belief that some truths are too vital to disappear, no matter the risk. Yet the challenges have grown exponentially. Medieval censors could only burn physical copies. Today's information suppressors deploy link removals, search engine demotions, and even AI-generated disinformation to muddy the waters. In response, contemporary librarians have adapted medieval tactics for the digital age. The practice of mirroring, creating duplicate copies of controversial works across multiple servers, directly descends from the medieval habit of splitting manuscripts into fragments dispersed across monasteries. Even the concept of encryption finds its roots in those coded marginalia and disguised bindings, updated for an era where steganography hides files in plain sight within image pixels or audio tracks. The ethical debates also persist. Modern librarians arguing against book bans or digital paywalls channel the same moral calculus as those medieval scribes who asked, "Is it dishonest to mislabel a text if that lie ensures its survival?" When the Internet Archive deliberately preserves copyrighted materials for scholarly access, or when academic librarians circumvent publisher paywalls to share research, they're walking the same tightrope between institutional rules and intellectual freedom. The key difference: scale. A medieval monk might save a single manuscript. Today's digital preservationists can safeguard entire libraries with a click and face exponentially greater consequences if caught. Perhaps the most profound legacy lies in how medieval cataloging strategies foreshadowed modern information architecture. The deliberate miscategorization that once hid heretical texts now manifests in algorithmic bias, where search results and recommendation systems effectively shelve certain perspectives out of sight. Activists today fight to make platforms disclose their classification systems, just as scholars once demanded transparency in library inventories. The medieval librarians who manipulated those inventories would recognize the stakes instantly. Control over categorization is still control over what counts as truth. This historical continuity offers both warning and inspiration. Warning because it reveals how easily systems meant to organize knowledge can become tools of suppression. Inspiration because it proves that resistance takes many forms, from a 13th century monk's false binding to a 21st century hacker's encrypted archive. The next time you struggle to find a controversial study buried in search results or encounter a paywall blocking access to research, remember, you're witnessing the latest chapter in a very old story. And like those medieval librarians, we're all left to decide: will we accept the catalogues we're given, or will we learn to read between the lines? Symbolic resistance pulsed through every deliberately misfiled manuscript and every falsely labeled tome. These medieval librarians weren't just preserving knowledge, they were engaged in a sophisticated act of intellectual rebellion. In an age when the Church wielded absolute authority over what could be read, studied, or even thought, these quiet revolutionaries used their catalogues as weapons of subtle subversion. Each mislabeled entry became a tiny fissure in the edifice of controlled thought, slowly expanding the boundaries of what was possible to know. Consider the implications of a single radical text disguised as a farming manual. On the surface, it maintained the illusion of compliance, but beneath that unassuming exterior, it preserved ideas that would one day help dismantle the very systems trying to suppress them. This wasn't passive preservation, it was active resistance through patience. Like intellectual time travelers, these librarians planted seeds they knew might take centuries to sprout. When Copernicus eventually accessed those hidden astronomical texts, or when Renaissance physicians rediscovered concealed medical knowledge, they were harvesting crops planted by medieval hands that had carefully tended forbidden ideas through generations of darkness. The resistance took many forms. Some librarians developed elaborate systems of accidental discovery, placing controversial works where only certain scholars would recognize their significance. Others created entire shadow collections, books officially recorded as lost or destroyed, but secretly accessible to trusted readers through coded references. A particularly bold method involved embedding radical ideas within approved texts, like grafting forbidden branches onto orthodox trees. A commentary on Scripture might contain subtle references to condemned philosophies, its heresies hidden in plain sight through careful wording. These weren't just acts of preservation, they were acts of defiance, proving that even in the most controlled environments, knowledge finds ways to leak through the cracks. What makes this resistance so remarkable is its quiet persistence. Unlike dramatic revolts or public protests, this was a centuries-long campaign of subtle obstruction. A librarian might spend decades slowly smuggling forbidden ideas into circulation through marginal notes, or patiently rebuilding a destroyed text from fragments scattered across monasteries. Their resistance didn't require grand gestures, just the daily courage to mislabel one more book, to sneak one more radical idea onto an overcrowded shelf. In doing so, they demonstrated that censorship's greatest weakness isn't loud opposition, but the quiet, determined refusal to comply. The legacy of this resistance shapes our world today. Every time we celebrate the free exchange of ideas or champion intellectual freedom, we're standing on the shoulders of those medieval librarians who understood a fundamental truth: knowledge can't truly be controlled, only delayed. Their quiet defiance reminds us that the battle for intellectual freedom isn't always fought in dramatic confrontations. Sometimes it's waged in the careful turning of pages, the strategic placement of books, and the deliberate, patient expansion of what a society dares to think. Medieval convents, often dismissed as quiet corners of prayer and domesticity, hid a startling secret. Their libraries were sometimes the safest havens for forbidden knowledge. While male monasteries faced frequent inspections, women's religious communities operated under a cloak of perceived harmlessness, their intellectual pursuits underestimated by church authorities. This cultural blind spot allowed figures like Hildegard of Bingen to build extraordinary collections under the guise of devotional work. Her 12th century Rhineland Abbey housed not just liturgical books but medical texts challenging Galenic dogma, cosmological diagrams contradicting biblical literalism, and even fragments of Gnostic gospels disguised as saintly visions. The very marginalization that excluded women from official scholarly circles became their greatest asset, who would suspect a nun's handwritten psalter of containing radical ideas. Herod of Landsberg took this subterfuge further at Hohenberg Abbey in Alsace. Her monumental Hortus Deliciarum, a garden of delights, appeared to be a standard encyclopedia for young novices, complete with colorful illustrations of biblical stories. But nestled between these orthodox teachings were subtle inclusions of condemned knowledge: astronomical charts showing Arabic star positions, medical diagrams based on dissection rather than ancient theory, even philosophical concepts from Jewish and Islamic scholars. Herod's genius lay in presentation. By framing controversial material as educational aids for pious women, she rendered it invisible to censors scanning for male scholarship. The work survived for centuries precisely because no one thought to look for heresy in a book designed for convent schoolrooms. The methods these women employed were often more inventive than their male counterparts. Without access to formal cataloging systems, they developed subtle alternatives using embroidery patterns as shelf marks, hiding sensitive texts inside looms, even encoding messages in the musical notation of choral books. A 13th-century psalter from a Bavarian convent contains what appears to be simple hymn notation, but when read vertically, the neumes spell out directions to a hidden compartment containing Neoplatonic texts. Other nuns exploited gender stereotypes directly. When authorities searched a French convent in 1289, they reportedly ignored a basket of women's work containing a disguised copy of the condemned Mirror of Simple Souls, its parchment pages carefully stitched into a tapestry's backing. Their legacy forces us to reconsider medieval intellectual networks. While famous university libraries like Paris or Bologna dominate historical narratives, convents often served as critical waystations for endangered knowledge. The correspondence of Italian nun Clare of Montefalco reveals how women's communities functioned as relay points, receiving controversial books from male scholars, temporarily sheltering them in innocuous bindings, then passing them along safer routes. Clare's letters describe disguising Averroes' philosophical commentaries as midwifery manuals, knowing inspectors would skim past women's matters. This informal network spanned from Spain to Germany, with literate nuns acting as silent partners in preservation. What makes their contributions particularly poignant is the double risk they undertook. Male librarians faced professional consequences, but women caught with forbidden texts risked accusations of witchcraft or possession. When the mystic Marguerite Porete was burned in 1310 for her book, The Mirror of Simple Souls, copies survived because Benedictine nuns in Flanders had secretly recopied it as advice for the devout heart, removing Marguerite's name but preserving her ideas. The stakes transformed their methods. Where monks might hide texts in plain sight, nuns often employed more radical dispersal tactics, breaking single volumes into fragments scattered across multiple convents, ensuring no complete copy could be seized. The rediscovery of these women's work continues to reshape our understanding of medieval thought. In 2014, spectral imaging revealed that a Book of Hours from a Rouen convent actually contained 7 different suppressed texts overwritten beneath its prayers, including a lost section of Hypatia's mathematical commentaries. Another study showed that over 60% of surviving fragments from Peter Abelard's condemned works were preserved in convents rather than monasteries. These findings don't just add footnotes to history, they rewrite entire chapters, proving that the preservation of Western thought wasn't solely the work of university scholars, but equally depended on the cunning and courage of women working in the shadows. Their story resonates powerfully today, as modern librarians and archivists continue battling similar forces of erasure. When digital activists create mirror sites to preserve censored information, or when contemporary nuns in Latin America safeguard indigenous texts from destruction, they walk in the footsteps of those medieval women who understood a profound truth, that sometimes the safest place to hide knowledge is where power least expects to find it. The convent's hidden libraries stand as testament to the enduring power of marginalized voices to safeguard ideas too vital to disappear. The catalogues of medieval libraries whispered in code, where every bland descriptor could carry concealed weight. A manuscript labeled curious might signal forbidden alchemical knowledge, while singular could hint at radical philosophical deviations from orthodoxy. This linguistic shadow play transformed dry inventories into treasure maps for those who knew how to read them. Take the case of the 14th century librarian Richard de Bury, whose meticulous records described certain texts as of particular interest to the discerning reader, a phrase that served as an open secret among his trusted circle. To outsiders, it sounded like scholarly praise. To initiates, it marked works the Church had condemned but de Bury deemed essential. The coding systems varied by region but shared common roots in monastic traditions. Some libraries used liturgical references as signals. A note that a text illuminates like the Feast of St. Lucy might indicate its controversial theories about light and vision. Others borrowed from herbalism, describing dangerous books with terms like thorny or pungent, suggesting their ideas required careful handling. The most sophisticated systems layered meanings. In a Swiss abbey's catalogue, the seemingly random annotation, Winter, Folio 22, directed scholars to a hidden compartment behind the 22nd shelf in the Winter Chapel, where Arabic medical texts were stored wrapped in liturgical vestments. This linguistic camouflage extended beyond catalogues into everyday library operations. A request for the red volume might fetch a banned astronomical treatise, its cover dyed crimson as an identifier. Fragments of poetry exchanged between scholars often contained acrostics spelling out shelf marks for controversial works. Even library architecture played along. A south-facing desk could be code for materials challenging geocentrism, while north signaled orthodox resources. The system's brilliance lay in its deniability. Every signal could be explained away as innocent if challenged. The risks of misinterpretation were real. In 1511, a visiting scholar in Cologne nearly sparked an inquisition by misreading vigorous as endorsement rather than warning. Only quick intervention from the head librarian saved him from requesting a text that would have marked him as a heretic. Such incidents forced refinements to the code. By the 16th century, some libraries developed tiered systems where notable meant controversial but acceptable, remarkable signaled borderline heresy, and extraordinary warned of ideas that could get a reader burned. Modern scholars are still unraveling these linguistic labyrinths. A breakthrough came in 2009 when researchers realized certain repetitive phrases in catalogues, worthy of deep study or demands mature consideration, correlated strongly with surviving copies of condemned texts. The patterns suggest an underground network of librarians sharing coding conventions across borders. Even more astonishing are the personal ciphers some employed. The librarian of a Bavarian monastery left behind a psalter with underlined letters that, when read sequentially, spelled out directions to his secret cache, under third step wrapped in lamb's wool. What began as survival tactics blossomed into a sophisticated intellectual tradition. These coded annotations didn't just preserve texts, they created an alternative canon, a shadow curriculum followed by generations of scholars brave enough to seek it. When Renaissance humanists later rediscovered classical knowledge, many were simply following breadcrumbs left centuries earlier in library catalogues. The real revolution wasn't in unearthing lost texts, but in finally being able to read their catalogue entries at face value. The legacy of this linguistic resistance endures wherever knowledge is threatened. From samizdat publications in Soviet Russia using Aesopian language to modern digital activists hiding controversial data in plain sight through steganography, the medieval librarian's playbook remains startlingly relevant. Their greatest lesson wasn't in how to hide truth, but in how to make it visible, but only to those prepared to see. Golden letters and vibrant pigments weren't just adornments in medieval manuscripts, they were camouflage for heresy. Picture an illuminated Bible, its ornate initials gleaming with gold leaf. To most viewers, the elaborate D at the start of Deuteronomy simply frames a scene of Moses receiving the tablets. But look closer. Hidden in the twisting vines of the letter's border, the artist has subtly painted the phases of the moon in precise astronomical detail, a direct challenge to the Church's Earth-centric cosmology. This wasn't careless decoration, it was calculated rebellion with a brush. The margins of these sacred texts became playgrounds for subversion. While the main pages proclaimed orthodox teachings, the edges whispered alternatives through seemingly whimsical doodles. A monk sketching a fox preaching to geese might appear to be illustrating a fable, until you realize the fox wears a bishop's mitre, lampooning church corruption. In the Luttrell Psalter, a grotesque hybrid creature with a monk's body and a rooster's head crows while defecating coins, a scathing commentary on clerical greed. These weren't random grotesqueries but carefully crafted critiques, surviving precisely because they masqueraded as harmless marginalia. Some illuminators took even greater risks by encoding entire alternative theologies in visual symbols. The 14th century Smithfield Decretals contains an initial T that initially seems to depict standard biblical scenes, until you notice the tiny, recurring motif of a salamander in flames. To initiates, this symbolized the Phoenix Christology condemned by the Fourth Lateran Council, a belief that Christ's divine nature couldn't suffer on the cross. By embedding this heresy in approved imagery, the artist ensured its survival while providing plausible deniability. The collaboration between illuminators and librarians was key to this visual deception. Scribes would leave strategic blank spaces in controversial texts, knowing illuminators would later fill them with corrective imagery. A passage denying the existence of antipodes might face an elaborate border showing fantastical creatures from those very non-existent southern lands. More daring still were the color-coded messages. Certain hues like verdigris green or Tyrian purple, expensive and rare, were used to highlight subversive elements only wealthy, educated patrons could afford to notice. Animal symbolism became a rich vocabulary for covert communication. An owl, officially representing wisdom, might secretly denote heresy when placed near certain texts. The humble hare, often painted fleeing hounds, could symbolize the persecuted Waldensians. Even plants carried hidden meanings. Ivy vines twisting around a crucifix might subtly reference the Gnostic concept of divine entanglement, while a strawberry plant's triple leaves nodded to the outlawed Trinitarian heresies of Joachim of Fiore. The Church's eventual crackdown only spurred more creativity. When authorities banned depictions of Aristotle's unmoved mover in 1500, illuminators responded by painting the philosopher's face on a peacock, a bird believed to have incorruptible flesh, thus symbolizing the very concept they were forbidden to show. Other artists developed dual image techniques. A pious scene at first glance would transform into something radical when viewed upside down or reflected in polished metal. A devotional image of the Magi might conceal, in the patterns of their robes, astrological charts contradicting biblical chronology. What makes these visual subversions so powerful is their enduring ambiguity. Unlike written words that could be definitively condemned, images always retained plausible deniability. A bishop might frown at an unusual marginal creature, but proving it represented heresy required interpreting intent, something even the Inquisition struggled with. This ambiguity became the illuminators' greatest weapon, allowing radical ideas to hide in the sacred heart of the very institutions trying to suppress them. Today, as we digitize these manuscripts with high-resolution photography, we're discovering layers of meaning their creators never intended us to see. Infrared imaging reveals underdrawings where artists first sketched even more daring symbolism before covering it with safer imagery. Spectral analysis shows pigments mixed with symbolic intent, certain blues fading predictably to expose hidden messages over time. Each technological advance peels back another veil, showing us that the most dangerous ideas in medieval Europe weren't always locked away in secret vaults, but glowing proudly on the page, visible to all yet understood by few. Their legacy challenges our modern assumptions about censorship and resistance, proving that sometimes the boldest dissent wears the guise of beauty. Buried beneath the approved texts of medieval Christianity lay whispers of entire belief systems that nearly vanished until cunning librarians gave them a second life. Take the Cathars, whose radical dualist theology shook 13th century Europe to its core. Church authorities ordered every Cathar text burned, determined to erase their claim that the material world was Satan's creation. Yet today, fragments survive not because they escaped the flames, but because a handful of Benedictine monks in Languedoc quietly rebound them as appendices to orthodox commentaries. One particularly daring example hides in plain sight at the Bibliothèque Nationale. A liturgical manuscript labeled Sermons on Mortal Sin actually contains Cathar rites of consolation, its heretical passages disguised as condemnations of heresy. The librarian who preserved it didn't just save parchment, he safeguarded a spiritual revolution that the Church had declared extinct. Arianism, the 4th century heresy denying Christ's divinity, met similar eradication efforts. Emperor Theodosius ordered every Arian text destroyed in 380, yet traces persist because Egyptian scribes recopied them as grammar exercises. A 6th century papyrus in Vienna's collection appears to be a student's handwriting practice until you notice the repeated phrases are actually Arian creedal statements, preserved through the fiction of pedagogy. These fragments reveal a startling truth. What mainstream Christianity later dismissed as fringe beliefs once commanded vast followings. The very fact that librarians risked their lives to save them suggests these ideas held profound resonance that institutional suppression couldn't erase. The survival tactics varied as much as the heresies themselves. Gnostic gospels condemning the Old Testament God as a malevolent demiurge were tucked inside volumes of Jewish scripture, the last place censors would look. Pelagian writings denying original sin hid in plain sight as Augustinian commentaries, their radical optimism about human potential camouflaged by selective editing. Even the Bogomils' radical asceticism, which rejected all church sacraments, endured in a single Bulgarian psalter where their prayers were overwritten in nearly identical ink as Orthodox litanies, visible only under ultraviolet light today. What makes these fragments so revolutionary isn't just their content, but what they reveal about medieval Christianity's diversity. The standard narrative paints the Middle Ages as uniformly orthodox, but these smuggled texts prove vibrant alternatives flourished underground. A 14th century manuscript from Catalonia contains a shocking hybrid, a Marian prayer with interpolated Manichaean verses praising the Queen of Light. Some librarian clearly knew this synthesis of approved devotion and condemned mysticism would fascinate future generations if it survived. The real tragedy lies in how much we've lost. When the Church burned the library of the Spanish heretic Priscillian in the 4th century, it extinguished an entire cosmology, blending Celtic paganism with Christian mysticism. Only 2 fragments escaped, both because a scribe in Trier copied them as examples of error before destroying the originals. Even this backhanded preservation gives us priceless clues like Priscillian's belief that the stars were divine messengers, a heresy so poetic it's heartbreaking to realize we'll never know it fully. Modern scholars now recognize these rescued fragments as more than historical curiosities. they're proof that Christianity's evolution wasn't inevitable. The ideas that lost their theological battles might have triumphed under different circumstances, shaping a radically different religious landscape. When a researcher in Milan recently discovered Waldensian sermons hidden inside a Dominican preaching manual, it wasn't just uncovering lost texts, it was recovering roads not taken, entire ways of being Christian that censorship tried to obliterate. The librarians who preserved these alternatives, even deceitfully, ensured that future generations wouldn't mistake the victor's version for the only story. Their legacy reminds us that history's losers often have the most fascinating tales to tell, if someone has the courage to keep them alive. Every librarian who deliberately misfiled a manuscript or falsified a catalog entry faced an impossible choice, one that still echoes wherever knowledge comes under threat. On one hand, they had sworn oaths to their institutions, to the very authorities demanding the destruction of certain texts. On the other, they carried an unspoken duty to the ideas themselves, to the voices that might be silenced forever if no one intervened. This wasn't simple defiance, it was a profound moral reckoning played out in the shadows of parchment and ink. Take the case of Brother Alcuin of Tours, who in the 12th century wrote agonized letters about his dual role as both censor and preserver. To strike a line from a page feels like severing a limb from the body of truth. He confessed, even as he continued altering controversial passages to make them palatable to church inspectors. His internal conflict mirrors that of modern archivists in authoritarian regimes, who must weigh personal safety against the imperative to preserve uncomfortable histories. The most fascinating cases reveal librarians who saw their deception as sacred work. A 14th century curator in Avignon left behind a coded journal describing how he smuggled Jewish medical texts into the papal library by rebinding them as volumes of canon law. "The Lord commanded us to heal, not to burn," he wrote, justifying his actions by framing them as obedience to a higher moral law. Similarly, when the abbess of Los Hulgas concealed feminist theological treatises behind embroidered altar cloths, she reportedly told her nuns they were protecting God's unfinished conversations with humanity. These weren't rebels thumbing their noses at authority, they were true believers in knowledge's sanctity, convinced their institutions had temporarily lost their way. Yet the ethical lines blurred in practice. Some librarians preserved texts they personally found dangerous, believing future generations should decide their merit. The Florentine scholar Niccolò Niccoli famously saved works by both radical mystics and their fiercest critics, arguing that truth emerged from their collision. Others made judgment calls about what deserved salvation, prioritizing scientific manuscripts over speculative philosophy, or hiding heretical prayers but burning manuals of demonic summoning. Their selectivity raises haunting questions. Who gets to decide which ideas are worth risking prison or excommunication for? Can we condemn those who drew the line differently than we might today? The pressure manifested in strange, poignant ways. Marginal notes in a Vienna manuscript reveal a librarian's nighttime ritual copying condemned passages onto thin parchment, then sealing them inside candle wax to be melted and read later. Another in Oxford developed an elaborate system of hand signals to warn colleagues when inspectors entered the scriptorium, his guilt etched in diary entries about trembling hands during Sunday Mass. The psychological toll was immense. These weren't career dissidents but ordinary people pushed to extraordinary acts of conscience. What's often overlooked is how their choices shaped our modern concept of intellectual freedom. When a librarian in Krakow chose to hide Copernicus' early heliocentric notes rather than burn them as ordered, he wasn't just saving a scientific theory. He was helping birth the idea that progress depends on preserving minority viewpoints. The same principle underpins everything from academic tenure to Wikipedia's neutrality policies today. Their dilemma forces us to ask, when institutions go astray, does true loyalty sometimes require disobedience? The answer, whispered across centuries in disguised catalogues and rebranded manuscripts, seems to be a resounding yes. These medieval guardians left no manifestos, no grand declarations of principle. Their philosophy survives in the quiet evidence of their actions, the mislabeled spines, the duplicated keys to forbidden cabinets, the manuscripts that somehow escaped the flames. They understood what too many forget, that the defense of knowledge isn't always a dramatic stand, but a daily commitment to subtle, stubborn preservation. In an age where information control takes new digital forms, their legacy isn't just historical, it's a mirror, asking who will choose to be when truth hangs in the balance. The digital landscape we navigate today mirrors medieval libraries in unsettling ways. Instead of robed librarians deciding which books to mislabel, we face algorithms that silently filter what we see. Search engines now play the role those medieval gatekeepers once did, their complex ranking systems determining which ideas rise to visibility and which vanish into obscurity. Think about how a single tweak to a platform's algorithm can bury controversial research just as effectively as a monk shelving a heretical text under agricultural almanacs. The tools have changed, but the power dynamics remain eerily similar. Control over categorization still means control over truth. Consider how modern shadow banning, where a user's content is suppressed without notification, parallels the medieval practice of losing manuscripts in catalogues. A social media post about vaccine side effects might be demoted in feeds not because it's false, but because it contradicts approved narratives, much like how a librarian might label a controversial astronomy text as speculative theology to keep it from prying eyes. Even the language of content moderation echoes the Church's index of forbidden books, with private corporations now making decisions about permissible discourse that once fell to religious authorities. The players have shifted from clergy to tech executives, but the underlying question persists: who gets to decide what knowledge is dangerous? Yet, just as medieval librarians found loopholes, today's digital dissidents employ similar tactics. Encrypted archives like Sci-Hub, which bypass paywalls to share academic research, function like those hidden monastery compartments where forbidden texts once waited for the right reader. Activists use metadata manipulation to make suppressed content appear innocuous, tagging a politically sensitive video as gardening tutorials recalls the way radical medical texts were disguised as herbals. Even blockchain technology, with its decentralized ledgers, mirrors the medieval strategy of scattering manuscript fragments across multiple locations to prevent total erasure. The same ingenuity that preserved knowledge against the bonfires of the Inquisition now fights algorithmic suppression and digital censorship. The stakes, however, have multiplied exponentially. Where a medieval librarian might risk a single text's destruction, today's information wars unfold at planetary scale. A single platform's policy change can erase entire schools of thought from public view. The Library of Alexandria burned once, but digital knowledge faces death by 1,000 cuts, link rot, paywalls, and deliberate deplatforming. This fragility makes the medieval librarians' lessons more vital than ever. Their greatest insight wasn't just about hiding knowledge, but about redundancy, ensuring multiple copies survived in diverse forms. Modern archivists now emulate this by creating data tombs, storing controversial information across decentralized nodes so no single takedown can eradicate it. What's most revealing is how both eras grapple with the paradox of protection. medieval librarians knew that restricting access could sometimes preserve ideas until societies were ready for them, just as modern platforms argue that limiting harmful misinformation protects democratic discourse. But history's verdict on those medieval choices is clear. The dangerous ideas they saved, heliocentrism, empirical medicine, religious tolerance, often proved foundational to progress. Their legacy challenges us to ask, which of today's suppressed knowledge might future generations mourn losing? The answer lies not in unfettered access nor heavy-handed control, but in the delicate balance those medieval librarians mastered, the wisdom to shield truth without smothering it. Beneath the dust of centuries, countless medieval manuscripts still guard their secrets untouched by modern technology, unread by contemporary eyes. In the Vatican's secret archives alone, scholars estimate less than half the 12th century catalogues have been systematically examined for concealed texts. Elsewhere, from the labyrinthine stacks of Spain's El Escorial to the shadowy recesses of Prague's Strahov Monastery, entire collections await the combination of curiosity and technology that might reveal their hidden layers. The recent discovery of a disguised Cathar ritual text beneath a 14th century breviary in Toulouse, revealed only when a graduate student noticed inconsistent ink fluorescence, proves how much heresy might still be hiding in plain sight. Some of the most promising hunting grounds are the miscellaneous sections of medieval inventories where librarians often dumped texts they couldn't or wouldn't classify properly. A cursory scan might list these entries as fragmentary or of uncertain origin, but spectral imaging has shown such labels frequently mask deliberate obfuscation. In the Bodleian Library's holdings, 9 supposedly anonymous sermon collections from the 13th century were recently proven to contain overwritten passages from the condemned theologian Amalric of Beni, their true authorship concealed beneath layers of careful palimpsesting. Similar finds in Austrian and Catalan archives suggest this was standard practice for preserving controversial works while maintaining plausible deniability. The real breakthroughs may come from pairing artificial intelligence with medieval cataloging patterns. Researchers at the University of Leiden are training machine learning algorithms to detect subtle anomalies in manuscript descriptions, phrases like "worthy of contemplation" or "demands discerning eyes" that medieval librarians used as coded signals. Early trials have already flagged 70 previously overlooked texts across European collections, including a mislabeled copy of Joachim of Fior's apocalyptic prophecies hidden in a Swiss monastery's accounting ledger. As these digital tools improve, they could uncover entire underground intellectual networks mapped through centuries of veiled references and strategic misfiling. Yet some mysteries resist even advanced technology. The legendary Catalogus Librorum Prohibitorum Absconditorum, a whispered about master list of hidden heretical texts compiled by 15th century librarians, has never been found, though marginal references to it appear in multiple sources. Was it destroyed as too dangerous, or does it still lie waiting in some forgotten ossuary, like the Nag Hammadi Gospels did for 16 centuries? Similarly intriguing are the persistent gaps in known transmission chains. How did radical Waldensian theology suddenly reappear in 16th century Germany after 200 years of supposed extinction? The answer likely lies in covert cataloging systems we haven't yet cracked. The search has taken on new urgency as climate change threatens vulnerable archives. When a flash flood damaged the Abbey of Monte Cassino's storerooms in 2021, conservators made an accidental discovery: a waterlogged psalter whose binding dissolved to reveal fragments of the long-lost Gospel of the 12 Apostles, a text the Church claimed was burned in the 6th century. Such near misses raise haunting questions. How many other fragile time capsules are deteriorating unnoticed, their secrets dissolving before we can read them? What keeps scholars digging through crumbling parchment and cryptic inventories is the possibility of rewriting intellectual history with each discovery. The recent identification of a botany manual in Bologna as actually containing Ibn Sina's suppressed quantum theories disguised through deliberate mistranslation shows how much we've underestimated medieval scientific sophistication. Every properly decoded catalog entry is like turning on lights in a room we didn't know existed, revealing conversations across time that censorship tried to silence. The real heresy, it seems, wasn't in the ideas themselves, but in believing they could ever truly be erased. The librarians who lied to protect forbidden knowledge were more than just custodians of books, they were guardians of the future. In an era when the penalty for heresy could mean burning at the stake, their quiet acts of deception mislabeled catalog entries, disguised bindings, and deliberate misfiling became lifelines for ideas too radical for their time. They understood something profound, that progress often depends not on bold declarations, but on the patient, cunning preservation of truths the world isn't yet ready to hear. Today, the scientific revolutions, philosophical breakthroughs, and cultural renaissances we celebrate owe an invisible debt to those who sheltered knowledge like embers in a storm. Consider the sheer audacity of their choices. A monk in 13th century Paris might spend decades copying medical texts under the guise of devotional literature, knowing he'd never live to see their impact. A convent librarian in Germany could risk excommunication to hide astronomical charts contradicting church doctrine, trusting that centuries later, someone would recognize their value. These weren't just acts of rebellion, they were acts of faith in the unfathomable ripple effects of ideas. When Copernicus finally pieced together his heliocentric model, he stood on the shoulders of generations of librarians who had safeguarded the fragments he needed, often without knowing why. Their legacy challenges our modern notions of information control. In today's digital landscape, where algorithms dictate what we see and governments censor search results, we're facing eerily similar battles over who gets to shape collective knowledge. The medieval librarian's playbook, dispersing copies, encrypting meanings, hiding truths in plain sight, has found new life in decentralized databases and blockchain archives. Their story proves censorship rarely succeeds in erasing ideas completely. It just forces them to evolve more creative ways to survive. Yet there's a deeper lesson here about the nature of truth itself. The most dangerous ideas, those that challenged entrenched power, didn't endure through force, but through fragility. They survived because someone chose to tuck them into the margins, to whisper them in code, to slip them between the lines of approved texts. This is the paradox of intellectual history. What authorities try hardest to suppress often becomes the very material that propels society forward. The librarians who lied understood that truth isn't just about facts, it's about timing. They preserved not for their own era, but for ones they could scarcely imagine. As we scroll through curated news feeds and navigate digital echo chambers, their example asks us unsettling questions. What truths are being hidden from us today? And more importantly, what truths are we, perhaps unknowingly, helping to hide? The next time you encounter a controversial idea, remember, the medieval librarians didn't judge which ideas deserved saving based on current dogma. They saved what they sensed might matter, even if they didn't fully understand why. In that spirit, let's turn the page to you. What forgotten or suppressed knowledge do you think still waits to be rediscovered? Share your thoughts below, because history has shown us that the most transformative ideas often begin as whispers in the margins.